Welcome to another episode of From Garage to Growth. This is the podcast where we look at the movers and shakers within the entrepreneurship space. And today we are looking at the steel industry and how it's kind of responsible for kind of building our modern world, but also kind of responsible for destroying it too. Every skyscraper, every bridge, and every car comes at a hidden cost with over 10% of global CO2 emissions. But the story we're going to explore today is what if AI could rewrite the story? And how does one go about disrupting a centuries-old industry using AI? So in this episode, I'm welcomed by Dr. Osas, the founder and CEO of DEEP.META, a startup using AI to transform steel production by making it more cleaner and more efficient. So to kick things off, I'd just like to give you the floor. Just introduce yourself and let the audience know who you are.
Hi, I'm Osas. I'm the founder and CEO of DEEP.META. DEEP.META is an AI company focused on making steel production more sustainable.
So as I've mentioned already, it kind of accounts for approximately 8 to 10% of global CO2 emissions, making it one of the largest industrial contributors to climate change. And given the urgency of meeting global climate goals, what are the key factors contributing to making steel production one of the largest contributors to CO2?
Yeah, so those are kind of split into like two different areas. One is the chemical reaction by which steel is made. And the second is the energy demand required to make steel, because steel is a alloy. And it's an alloy that is majority iron, and iron has a very large heat capacity and a relatively high melting point. Subsequently, it requires a lot of energy to process it. So I'll break it up into these two different areas and just try and walk through it. So the first part is sort of the chemical reaction and the process of making steel. So usually when you make steel, you can make it through two different routes. One is the blast furnace route, and the other one is the electric arc furnace route. When you go via the blast furnace route, you need to start with iron ore. And when you have iron ore, you basically need to reduce it. And so reducing means iron ore is like an iron oxide. So iron and it's attached to all these different oxygen atoms. So how do you take off these oxygen atoms so you're just left with the iron that you can then use for other production steps? And so the process of removing those oxygen is called reduction. So basically the reductant that you used to react with the iron ore for a long time and still today in many different applications is coking coal. So not the coke that was made famous in the 90s, but rather the kind that is basically like it's a coal, but it's been hyper purified, if you like, in a way. The water has been removed, it's been dehydrated, so it's a lot tougher, and also it heats up to a much higher temperature. So that basically helps to remove the oxygen from the iron ore. And that happens in this thing called a blast furnace vessel, right? And this vessel gets super hot. You know, it's like a human-made volcano. That's literally the best way to describe it. A human-made volcano where you're just ripping off oxygen atoms, right? And when your constituent element in coking coal is carbon, so if you have those carbon atoms ripping off oxygen off of the iron ore, then you're left on as a byproduct with carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, amongst a bunch of other slew of different compounds. But here in this particular conversation, we're focused on why is it so emitting, and it's because of that first step. How do you go from iron ore to just like plain old iron? And it's that bit of the process. And the second is just the energy demand. Like I mentioned, it has a large heat capacity. When you want to heat it up, it requires a lot of energy to heat up. So for subsequent processes after that, there are heating steps, and those heating steps requires energy. Where do you get the energy from? For the most part in the world, we do not have a decarbonized electrical grid. And sometimes the sources of energy are natural gas, which they themselves have a byproduct of carbon dioxide. And so those are the aspects that leads to it being such a demanding material, despite how useful and how critical it is. Unless, of course, you are in Canada. If you're in Canada, you can potentially run a steel plant off of hydroelectricity. And, you know, I know a few, and it's CO2 is less of a problem there for them. So, I mean, there will come a time when we're going to run our plants off of renewable energy sources. But before that time comes, this is a problem for the world at large.
And you're speaking about using other alternative sources. which is green steel. What's kind of keeping us from kind of mainstreaming this production of green steel? What factors are there in place currently and the obstacles that we need to kind of overcome to make it more a viable option?
Yeah, there's, I think, quite a few to overcome. I'm happy to speak to some of them. So there are a bunch of different ways that people are thinking about doing that first step. How do you go from iron ore to iron? People think about this in a different way. Some people think about using electrolysis. Some people are thinking about using laser, come up with all kinds of really interesting ideas. When I speak with people from the steel industry, time and time again, how they think about this is they typically think about this using technologies that have been around for decades. And that technology is called direct iron reduction. So directly reduced iron, or more commonly referred to as DRI. And so it's basically a blast furnace, but without the blast. So instead of it being super hot, basically very in a controlled manner, you introduce gases that can act as a reductant, right? So same thing, stripping off oxygen off of the iron, but you're doing it in such a way that it's at a lower temperature than blast furnace, and the byproducts of CO2 aren't as much, right? And for the most part, the typical reductant that's being used in that case, the DRI, tends to be methane. And the way that the industry is thinking about this, hey, look, we can replace methane with hydrogen, right? So and it's very possible to reduce iron oxide using hydrogen, right? And that's something that people are thinking about. And it's an interesting one. And so like some of the blockers preventing that from happening tomorrow are the availability of hydrogen, especially green hydrogen. It's quite expensive to make. I don't think that we are in a place where anyone has yet demonstrated a way to make, for example, green hydrogen from water, for example, using a solar panel, with getting out more energy than you put in. It's almost a little bit like the problem with nuclear fusion. Like we can do fusion, we can do nuclear fusion, but it just requires more energy to,
Than we currently
get to that than we get out. But if we can get out more energy than we put in, then it's like, okay, now we're just on this like downward in this hill and we're just rolling and nothing can stop us, right? And that's where you want to get to generally speaking with all these energy sources. And we're up against a problem there with getting to green hydrogen in a way that's cost effective and makes sense for the industry. Because at the end of the day, steel is a commodity, right? It's a commodity that's traded globally. Like with the advent of green steel, there is becoming like increasing amounts of differentiation between some of these commodities. And don't get me wrong, there are some specialist steel grades, right? But the bulk of steel is pretty commoditized. The advent of green hydrogen is meaning that there is some differentiation. People saying, hey, this steel has zero amounts of carbon dioxide to make this. I think it was a car company in Europe. They released a car that was supposedly like 0% carbon, right? Because it had been made from all these materials where there wasn't any CO2 emitted in the process. It's very much like it's very cool demonstration where we can be, but it's not something that they can do yet at scale. And so the cost associated with actually with doing these sort of like premium green products it's still a little bit on the high side. There are some people that are willing to pay for these green premiums. And, you get some car companies that want to have like some of their products made from green steel, or some construction companies, but the premium is still a little bit like it's prevents it from being adopted by a large number of
the mainstream.
people. Yeah, exactly.
And one of the other aspects of steel that's kind of makes it such a high producer is the waste aspect of it, with over 25% of steel being either scrapped or reworked. Can you kind of run us down through how does this waste aspect look within it? Are we looking at like skyscrapers of steel or cars? How large is the waste or the reproduction of steel?
Yeah, interesting one. So I think if you say that to most steel producers, they won't want to admit that it's 25% being wasted, and they'll say that you don't know what you're talking about. But I hear what you're saying, and I get where you're going with this. Basically, like during steel production, you have yield losses, and these yield losses occur for various reasons. some of which can be controlled or avoided, some of which is a bit harder to avoid. Like I mentioned, the blast furnace process, right? Some of the iron you make actually gets lost as slag. Slag is a byproduct from making steel, and it's tricky to extract the iron from that. But some of the iron just gets soaked away into this like foam, right? So that does happen. So there's some things that can be avoided, others that can't be avoided. For those that can be avoided, the amount of steel that's wasted, what can I compare it to? Is it 10 elephants? Is it 5? It's tricky to say, to give like a comparison for what that would look like in terms of a volume.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be able to like just give an accurate assessment of that. But let's just say that it's a fair amount and it costs enough that steel producers care about it, to monitor this on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. And they're consistently trying to get these numbers down. Because the thing is that, right, they've already invested money and effort and process time into making these products. If the yields are lower, if it's 98% instead of being 100%, then that's 2% of energy or manpower, etc., that has just been completely wasted that they can't sell, or they have to sell at a lower price because it doesn't meet the spec of the first customer. So which is problematic. Right? And it's in these sort of process control aspects that we at DEEP.META think we can be super helpful. Basically, a lot of how process optimization is done today tends to be focused on looking at individual machines. So how do I make this one machine work much better, right? And that's typically because you would have, say, a contract with the person that provided that machine to you, and they are charged with improving that machine and maintaining it. It's all well and good and very necessary. But typically speaking, the way that optimization happens within the plant is either looking at a machine or maybe a group of machines or limited scope on processes. But there are lots of interdependent processes within steel production on understanding how all of those interrelate is very meaningful because it allows you to be able to make a decision that isn't just optimal for this part that you're looking at right now, but is actually optimal for the entire system. And this is where, from an AI perspective, we think that reinforcement learning can be actually very, very useful. So our approach to this is to not just optimize or look at one part production, but to think about the entire workflow as a single system, which it is, but it's very difficult to observe it as a single system if you are a human being with like a limited number of data points that you're trying to analyze and stream together. It's much more effective for an AI to take all these inputs and subsequently be able to provide useful insights as to what can be done. And where we see some potential, like where we started off, is in like a relatively highly energy intensive part of production. These are basically looking at downstream, looking at reheat furnaces and getting products finished. So the end product that we were kind of referring to when we spoke about yield losses, etc., and them caring a lot about what the outcome looks like, that is something that we are focused on. So how do we go from these reheat furnaces to finished products that can be sold and the customer is happy with?
And your startup journey or your founder journey kind of started during your time doing your PhD. During that time, how did you spend a lot of time within the steel industry? How did you go about figuring out in terms of, there's an inefficiency happening here, and I have an idea that can solve this? When did you get your light bulb moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we usually get the kind of ideas, it can come at the time. For me, it wasn't during the PhD as such, but it was in reflecting on my experiences during the PhD. It's like, actually, this is how people used to do things. So I was really fortunate for my PhD so my PhD was on efficient manufacturing processes for steel rod. And I got to work with R&D and I got exposure to the production lines. And that gave me like a pretty decent understanding of how things work in steel production sites and the different groups that would interplay and where information can be exchanged just to make the whole operation work. And after the PhD, I continued working in manufacturing. I worked in a laser manufacturing place, worked in a place that was manufacturing packaging. And it was through these experiences I'm acquiring more and more exposure to this industry. And it just became apparent that there could be better ways to approach optimization than we were approaching, than the way that we were approaching it. Like I alluded to before, the way that super-use optimized state typically focuses on, quite limited scope. And that subsequently makes it hard to find the global minima for their system. So, you want to try and rather than finding a local minima, like, okay, this is the optimal process for this part, you want to find what it is globally across the system. And those tools to be able to do that just did not exist. And so what I began doing, I began to explore basically like, was it just an interesting anecdote from the experience that I had? Or is this a problem that is actually consistent across many different steel production sites? So what I went on to do was get on the phone to different steel producers around the world. Some people you message on LinkedIn, some people you'll use like tools to find out what their email is. Others you'll just try and you find the direct line to the plant. You just go through to the operator, be like, oh, hey, can I speak to so and so? And like, yes, sure, I'll put you through. And then before you know it, you're on the phone with this really important person. But all those exposures gave me the opportunity to build a relationship with the industry, first of all, but also just to begin to verify, like, okay, was this just like a one-off observation that I had? Or is this a status quo? Is this how you guys operate right now? And, what's the appetite for improving this? And it turns out that it was a pretty consistent behavior across many, many plants. And for those who did want to adopt more advanced ways of optimization using AI for various things, they've had a difficulty in actually retaining some of that talent. I remember someone telling me that they basically hired this really smart guy who was going to be their AI guy because they have all this data, but there isn't much that's being done with it effectively. But I think within like a year or so, the guy went off to go and do a master's, which is all well and good. People should upskill, but end up working like for some high tech company in Silicon Valley. And so, which is well and good for that person's career and development. But then the people who were sort of relying on and hoping that he would come back and, add value to the industry, they're at a loss. And so even to try and do like internal stuff is challenging. So that's another reason why like they do need to look outside. And we think that the approach that we take is one that can be really genuinely helpful to the industry. Because rather than providing like sort of like makeshift solutions here and there for just different parts of their plant, we're offering this holistic approach to optimization, giving them a viewpoint that empowers the end user, to provide them insights and access that they otherwise wouldn't have had. And so even for those who do have AI people on their site, actually we can help them to make their lives better because their work is probably very project-based. And whereas we're providing you access to be able to see your plant in a whole new light.
And as a founder, it's widely recognized that you need a lot of elements to kind of build an individual into a founder. What do you feel were those experiences that kind of built you into this founder you are now? And how did those experiences influence your movement and your transition from academia to being a founder to finally starting your own business?
Yeah, those are great questions. Ones which are super interesting. I think that a bunch of things led me to the state to become the person that I am now. To take this jump and leap to becoming a founder of a company. I would say that they are, one, my experience as a young person in church. Like, I don't know. So I was quite active in like youth church, and that we had this annual event called Are You Alive? Which is a big question to ask people. Are you alive? Because, people think, well, if I'm reading it, surely I am. And then it opens up for a more interesting discussion. Anyhow, we had to put together this like a variety show. We were teens, in our late teens, and it required like quite a great deal of organization. There were lots of different events that were happening that day. And then you also had to market it and make sure people came, etc. And we'd have like 300 people turn up, and the venue would be so packed that people wouldn't even be able to sit, And then like be that for people that are interested in what's going on. It was also just like a really good time. Like it was a good thing to do on a Saturday. Like it was fun for a lot of people, including us. And then all the while, we're also the ones, not just organizing, but the ones on stage. And so you get into this mindset of, actually, if you begin to build confidence in being able to do, like being able to excel, actually, if I think about this, I can do this. And so I think it probably started there, this sort of sense of independence and having the ability to do. I think that's where it started. And I think another cementing experience was the PhD. I think not enough people rate the PhD as being a non-academic experience. As a non-academic experience, I believe you do quite a lot of research yourself as well, right? I'm sure you can relate to this, but the journey of the PhD, or in the case, the researcher, is for many people quite a lonely one. And it has so many analogies with being an entrepreneur. I know like a bunch of people who have done PhD and then started companies, like, it's just like doing the PhD again. Like this sort of maybe a sense of, am I the right person to be doing this? Or am I, do I have what it takes? And then having to overcome these barriers yourself. You have people who are supposed to be supporting you, but it's in the PhD, it really is just you. It just comes down to you.
Yeah.
And I think it makes you build a certain resilience and tenacity, which I think it makes it a lot easier to face on certain circumstances. And also with the PhD, you're often faced with like a very vague, nebulous question, and you have to find a concrete answer to. So you spend a lot of time framing the question and then testing suitable hypotheses and being able to design experiments to test them as you go through. It's very much like doing a startup, but startups are just done at a much higher rate, right? PhDs have a bit more time to do them. With startups, it's less about the experience and more about the result, but it's still the same kind of mechanism. And I think the same sort of like personality rigor that you need to be able to do both. I think that more PhDs should start companies. I think there's some stats about it, actually. If I recall, I think a lot of people that start companies have PhDs. So the evidence is there.
Yeah. So you spoke about the journey and how the PhD journey, it's a solo journey you're doing to prove this idea, this hypothesis that you have. Where I feel like the startup journey is very contrast, where it's a very community-based journey. So you had an opportunity to be part of the Black Founders Fund, and which is a community of Black founders within the European ecosystem. How was that experience with you with regards to being in a group of other people that look like you, that have had experiences that you can relate to as a Black founder? How has it been being a part of that community as a founder?
Yeah, I think it's been great. I think that it's been a community whereby you can genuinely get feedback on product, and give feedback on other people's products, and can access people's networks, whether it be investors, etc. People just providing helpful insights in general. And you have a sense of camaraderie, like you just know that this person has your back. You have a very strong sense of confidence that everything that I'm being told or that's been suggested to me is genuinely for my good. You have a strong sense of trust for that person. So I think it's been very pleasant. It's been, I think a lot of people have found it refreshing. I think there's a way to describe it. It's been refreshing. I think it's also been very inspiring because many of these entrepreneurs are doing incredible things. And when you see them achieving big things, you're like, okay, it's possible. Why not me? And sometimes in life, you just need to be able to see that. Sometimes that's often like positioned as in the context of the young person growing up, and they see someone that they can aspire to be like, but it need not always be that way. Sometimes it can be your contemporary, right? Someone that's not too far removed from you. You don't have to wait 5-10 years to try to achieve that. Actually, well, if that person did that, then why can't I? And then you can go about it and do it in 6 months, 10 months, however long it will take you. But yeah, very inspiring. And that has provided like ample motivation to push forward with what I'm doing at DEEP.META.
Yeah. So one of the striking aspects of DEEP.META itself is that it eliminates this notion of steel plants investing money in terms of building new hardware or building new software. You bring the software to them. How exactly does your software adapt effortlessly to existing frameworks or infrastructure within the steel plants to kind of revolutionize whatever is there already and improve on it?
Yeah. So our approach to doing this is quite an interesting one. I can't go into too much detail, but at a very high level is that we found a way to be able to very cost effectively replicate processes within that steel production environment. So what's, I guess, useful to know is that when you want to make steel, for most kinds of steel, it's typically the same kind of machinery. But what does change is the interaction between those machines, between different sites, right? And we can really effectively capture those interactions between the machines. And we call those the dynamics of the system, right? It's like going to a club, right? At a club, you got people who are dancing, you got some people who are by the bar, you got people that are chilling. You might go to a different club, but it's still the same thing. It's still the same mix of people, just in different positions, but it's still all the same basic things that make up the club experience, right? And of course, the loud music. And so we are able to, we know what the basic components of a club night are. And we have this toolbox that allows us to basically replicate the dynamics of the club, in this case, of the steel plant. And subsequently, when our AI agents are training these environments, it's a very close replica of the site. And hence, the insights that are provided are tailored to that site. But it doesn't require us to sort of like start from scratch every time. It's very much like Lego blocks. We can grab the blocks that we need and we're able to construct it super fast, which makes it very replicable and scalable, which is why we're quite excited about the potential that this can have across multiple sites in the industry.
Yeah, and in that sense, you spoke about the potential. With like AI currently being the talk of the town, like recently DeepSeek kind of taking over the conversation a little bit the past few weeks. Do you foresee a future where AI could enable fully autonomous steel plants? And if that is possible, what impact will that have on the industry's environmental footprint and operational efficiency?
Great question. Yeah, what DeepSeek has done of this is incredible. It's really interesting. And the pricing they've done it for has blown everyone away.
Yeah.
So so obviously their approach, right? One key ingredient of their approach is using reinforcement learning for some other aspects that were done differently by some of their competitors, right? And that whole process is basically it's to encourage self-learning and really effective self-learning. So can we have self-learning steel plants, right? End to end? Yes, I think we can. And there are some sites in the world, very few, that are getting close to full autonomy. Are they fully self-learning? I don't think they are, but they probably have like set operational windows of how they're supposed to operate. But can we get to a place where we have a fully autonomous plant that's able to react to, or not just react, is able to anticipate and avoid issues occurring just seamlessly? I think that's on its way. I don't think that we're there yet. I think that it's still some time away. I mean, what's definitely, because obviously in that situation, you're going to have less people working on the steel.
Yeah.
And there's obviously economic impact to the communities that have been built around steel as a culture, way of life in all of the world. And what we've seen over the past 40 years is there being significant reduction in the number of people who are working in steel plants. And I think that trend is going to continue. So the industry is already moving in that direction towards autonomy. So that the people who are working in the steel plants become even more specialized and more highly skilled. And so I think that's the way that it's going to go. It's something that's on the horizon. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 15 years, maybe 20 years. That's going to happen. And that's less about the technology and more about people's behavior. So, and people wanting to give up that sort of independence. So maybe after the current generation has stopped working, then I think that we might begin to see some substantial shifts. But it's a funny one because it's not just a technological challenge. You need to manage the economics around it and how it impacts people's lives.
Yeah. And it's definitely one of those where it's not just improving, but it will lead to other issues as well. Like it's a ripple effect throughout just operational basis of the economy itself. So yeah, it's definitely a big one.
Yeah.
So recently, you guys completed one of your UK innovative projects, and through that project, you came up with your I'll say an MVP product, which is your Deep Optimizer. Can you run us through how this product or this copilot AI has kind of revolutionized the operational basis of steel plants?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So our first product is the Deep Optimizer. It's one that we're pretty proud of. It is a multiple product software. So it has lots of different products inside one piece of software that address the needs of different parts of steel production. So we take, like I mentioned, this full view of what's going on. And so we're able to have like quite a bit of influence at different parts of production. But the heart of the product is what we like to call the furnace copilot. And it is at its heart now a recommender system. So one that is uncertainty that people have in steel plants is knowing precisely when products are ready. And our approach is able to reduce the time spent in the furnaces by around 60 minutes, sometimes more. And that leads to an energy saving of around 40 kilowatt hours per ton, which is a substantial amount of energy over the course of the year. And so the way we communicate the recommendations that IT made is we basically indicate to the operators as to when a product is ready and which one should be removed next. And so this is quite simple when I explain it like that. But the impact it has on the plant is quite significant because actually it helps with the pacing of the plant, how if you like, cadence at which the plant produces material. And that is quite important for the plant's stability. And so the recommendations that we make help to basically reduce the variance in the production process and to increase the stability of the process. And that increased stability is what allows us to be able to do more with less, save energy, reduce CO2, and also in this case, increase the productivity of the plant.
Which is great. So the world is aiming for net zero emissions by 2050. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the steel industry kind of contributing to this? And where do you see DEEP.META playing a role with regards to getting us there?
Yeah. So I think the steel industry is quite progressive in that it's doing quite a bit of work towards reducing its CO2 footprint. It knows that it's a meaningful contributor to CO2. It does what I think 8% of greenhouse gas emissions are from steel. And so it knows that it has a responsibility to reduce its emissions. And so many people have pledged to be net zero by 2030. Some want to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. So there's lots of these global corporate objectives are being set by very, very large steel plants. And then you have like the World Steel online organization. And for a long time, they have been collating the data from different steel plants about their emissions and tracking their emissions over time. And some of the biggest steel producers in the world are part of them. And the idea there is that you want to try and build accountability within the environment, within the community, as to how we are producing and to produce more sustainably over time. So I think the net travel for steel is in the right direction. I think that people have a strong willingness to want to reduce their emissions. So I think they're going to be a significant contributor towards achieving net zero by 2050. In terms of the role that DEEP.META is going to play in this, we think it's going to be quite a critical and exciting one. So in the short term, before we can get really cheap hydrogen to do directly reduce iron, we need to find ways to reduce emissions now. So we see DEEP.META as being an immediate response to this urgent need. And that being, hey, look, we have all this data in our plants. We're really well instrumented, i.e. sensors everywhere. The current approaches we have, optimization are limited. before we fork out 2 billion to get a new part of the plant, what can we do right now to reduce our emissions and also be able to increase our profitability? Hitting these two marks in one go is where we find ourselves being super helpful. And what we're hoping for is, with the increased profitability that our customers can have, with those margins, they can use that towards investing in technologies that can get them further down the line of being increasingly neutral on the CO2 aspect. And so, at scale, they're aiming for a global reduction of CO2 in the steel industry of 20%. That's around 500 megatons of CO2. We think that's pretty substantial. That can change quite a bit in terms of how much is being emitted from the industry. But we know that we are one step within a grander scheme of things, and a critical step that the industry needs to take towards being operationally efficient.
Yeah. And as we kind of reach the end of our conversation, I usually have 2 questions that I throw out to people. So the first one is, if you could go back to your younger self, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Good question. What advice would I give my younger self? I would tell myself to focus on doing what you're doing, and be focused on really being good at that thing of what you're doing. Because I think competency is really important. And the longer you spend improving something, you will be very good at it. And it can be a good edge to then branch off from. Because a lot of what people do right now is tangential to their core skill, but their core skill is complementary. But so long as you have that really strong base, I think that's important. And I will just encourage myself to trust the process. Just go through the motions, trust the process. Because you might want to feel rushed to achieve something by a certain time when you're younger. But actually, I think just being focused and trusting the process are key things.
And the last question, what advice would you have for young founders that are starting off the startup journey, the founding journey? What would you have liked to know before you started your journey that you would impart into young founders?
So those are 2 different questions. What would I like to know versus what would I advise them? So I might answer that in 2 parts. What I would advise young founders starting off today is be in search of a problem rather than a solution in search of a problem. So if you have, rather than trying to fit your idea to a problem, search out for a real problem that people genuinely care about. And that way you'll be able to get a much faster and satisfying feedback loop, rather than being in this sort of feedback loop of getting really poor feedback because people don't really care about what you're doing. And then you might find yourself going on and not making the progress you want, which can be frustrating. So I'd recommend be very problem focused, be obsessed with the problem rather than the solution. What would I like to have known? It's a different thing. That one, again, requires more reflection, which will come up in my book.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'll be looking on LinkedIn to see any posts of the book coming out.
Maybe 20, maybe.
Yeah, I will definitely looking for it. So the last thing I want you to kind of tell us, where do people find you if they're looking for you, if they want to collaborate with you? Where do they find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. Osas Omoigiade, my name. Look for me on LinkedIn. If you type in Osas DEEP.META, you'll find me. I think that's the best place to look for me. I am not very active on social media, as you can see. Yeah, that was initially a deliberate choice made, I think, in my early 20s. And now it's just become a lifestyle. And it's quite a freeing one. I don't feel tied down to update several social medias in one day. Just the thought of it horrifies me. But yes, find me on LinkedIn. That's the best place. Or better still, come on to Garrison Growth, and you can find me through Brian.
That's a great idea. So I'd just like to say thank you for being here. And that's it from us. Check us on the next episode of From Garage to Growth.